"You arrogant, black-betouched, who do you think you are?" the white cop barked, then kicked her straight in the stomach, right in the middle of the courtroom. He didn't care who she was, just another nobody to him. But seconds later, she stood up, calm and silent, and pulled out a governor's badge. The room froze. His arrogance collapsed. Watch till the end to see why all of America is now asking who's the real threat inside the courtroom. The polished stone floor reflected the steady footsteps of a black woman moving down the hallway. She didn't rush, nor did she pause to observe anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the courtroom at the end, where rows of wooden benches were ready for the morning session. No one paid attention. They were used to people coming and going, to ordinary citizens asking for trial delays, to the anonymity of those who blended into the background. But if anyone had watched closely enough, they would have noticed one thing. Her steps carried no hesitation. The jade green coat she wore wasn't the typical office attire. It was simple, elegant, bearing no insignia, and didn't follow any bureaucratic color scheme. Her hair was neatly tied at the back of her neck, revealing a sun-kissed face, firmly closed lips, and a focused gaze. She wore no name tag, carried no folder, and was not accompanied by anyone. If someone tried to determine her status based on appearance, they would get nowhere. She entered the courthouse like someone who needed no introduction. From the far end of the hallway to the left, Brody emerged holding a steaming plastic cup of coffee. One hand gripped the cup while the other adjusted the flap of his police uniform. As he looked up, his gaze immediately landed on the woman. He paused for a beat. Something about the way she moved struck him as odd. She didn't bow her head, didn't wait for orders from anyone. Brody narrowed his eyes, slowed his steps, and let his gaze sweep across her back as though inspecting an untagged item. As he drew level with her, she was already nearing the courtroom door. "Got business here, sweetheart?" he said, his voice rough yet measured, laced with the arrogance of someone used to catching others in the wrong. The question wasn't loud enough to draw attention across the hallway, but it was clear enough for her to understand she was being assessed. The woman stopped and turned her face toward him, her gaze composed. There was no anger, no provocation in her eyes. It was cold. Cold enough to make Brody tighten his grip on the coffee cup. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for another moment, then spoke in a low voice, each word distinct. "I'm here to observe justice in motion." Brody let out a faint chuckle, tilting his head as if he had heard that line 100 times. But no one had ever said it with eyes like that, eyes that made him feel like he was the one being watched. As she stepped beyond Brody's reach and moved toward the gallery seating, he remained motionless, his lips pressed into a line, his eyes following her slow, unhurried steps. Her leather shoes made no sound, but the weight of her presence echoed in his mind, like footsteps pounding on the floor of his accustomed authority. Seconds later, Brody exhaled softly and turned to look at her again. That faint sense of unease, something not wrong, not off, but not quite right either, began to stir, and true to habit, he called it by the name he knew best: suspicion. The wooden benches at the back of the courtroom still had plenty of open seats. The woman chose a spot in the middle, gently setting her small bag beside her. No one noticed the gesture. Most people in the courtroom that morning were busy checking their phones, organizing files, or sharing brief words with colleagues. Everything moved as usual, except for the presence of someone Brody had never seen before, and perhaps had never expected to face in such a way. From his spot near the reception desk, Brody kept his eyes on the way she sat. She didn't fidget like someone entering a courtroom for the first time. She didn't look cautious like someone who had been summoned before. And she certainly didn't carry the air of a familiar assistant. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench, her shoulders steady and unburdened, as if the weariness of the morning hadn't touched her. Brody approached. The sound of his shoes against the wood floor didn't cause her to look up. Only when he stopped beside the row of seats and raised his hand in a familiar gesture did she slowly turn her face toward him. "This seat is not for the uninvited." His voice wasn't loud, but the familiar fire of authority was etched into every word. She didn't shrug, didn't look surprised. Her eyes met Brody's directly. They lacked the guardedness usually triggered by a uniform. There was no attempt to explain herself. It was a gaze Brody didn't often encounter, one that didn't ask for validation. "I don't need an invitation to be present where justice stands." The words came out steady and clear, not emphatic, not provocative. Yet something in that answer made several nearby heads suddenly lift. A few people glanced over, not out of curiosity, but because her voice had sliced through the room's formal air like a cold blade cutting through polished routine. Brody tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. In that moment, he wasn't just facing a stranger. He was facing something he had never been trained to handle, a presence that defied classification. He didn't know who she was, but the answer she had given made every familiar mental label fall away. A voice echoed from farther off, a young lawyer speaking with the court clerk. The brief disruption drew Brody's attention for a second, but he turned back to her quickly. The restraint in his expression began to tighten. He stepped forward half a pace. The distance between them is now close enough to catch the rhythm of each other's breath. His jaw clenched. His gaze lowered slightly, as if willing her to look away. But she didn't, and Brody, used to holding the upper hand, felt the ground beneath him shift just slightly. A court officer seated a few rows back glanced over, half rose from his seat, then stopped. Something about the scene made him hesitate, not because he wasn't allowed to act, but because he wanted to see what this was turning into. Brody stepped back a little, not to retreat but to reposition, then lowered his voice. "I'll ask again, in what capacity are you here?" This time the question wasn't a routine probe. It carried something even Brody wouldn't admit, an unease creeping into his voice. The woman remained seated, back straight, hands resting on her lap, her gaze unshaken. "In the capacity of someone who knows what's right, deserves to be witnessed, not permitted." No one said a word after that, but inside Brody, something had already been stirred, and he knew that if he didn't shut it down soon, he would lose control. And that was something he had never allowed to happen with anyone. Brody stood in front of her, chest puffed out as if the distance between them had to be measured by rank. Even though she hadn't lifted a finger, he treated the situation as if he were confronting a subject needing control. "Why are you here at the courthouse?" This time the question came louder, with deliberate intent. The drawn-out final syllable echoed off the high ceiling, prompting nearby heads to turn. The woman's silence struck harder than any threat-laced tone Brody had grown used to using as part of his routine. "To sit," she replied, "and to see whether you'll do your job right." Her words needed no volume. They stripped away Brody's familiar posture of power, reducing him to the role his uniform truly represented, a man under scrutiny, not someone to be automatically respected. Behind them, Finch, the young officer walking with Brody, froze in place. He didn't look at her. He looked at Brody. Caught between tension and awkwardness, Finch tried to lighten the moment with a whispered question. "Who is she?" His voice was low, but not low enough to escape the ears of those nearby. Brody glanced sideways at his partner and waved him off, as if to crush any uncertainty before it spread. "Probably some lost lady who thinks courtrooms are places to perform citizenship," he said, not to her but loud enough for those around to hear. People who had been looking for a reason to avert their eyes from the woman now found justification to nod in agreement. A few awkward smirks emerged from the far corners of the courtroom, enough to form the illusion of a crowd picking. The woman watched silently, unmoved by the whispers now starting to spread. She didn't need to lift a finger to reveal the imbalance in how she was being treated. It was Brody's hurry to rally support that offered the clearest proof. He couldn't find a rationale, so he turned to find allies. Finch glanced at her, then quickly looked away. There was something in her gaze that unsettled him, not because she was confrontational, but because she wasn't defensive. Every trained response had taught him how to handle threats, but no one had prepared him for a moment when the only threat was his superior's pride being rattled by an unflinching stare. The air in the courtroom hadn't shifted, obviously, but those sitting nearby seemed to be adjusting their posture. No one spoke, but their eyes began to linger longer on Brody. A few checked their phones, not to scroll, but to ensure that if something were to happen, they were ready to record. Brody felt it. He clenched his jaw, tightened the hand near his waist, and narrowed his eyes as if scanning a scenario. In his mind, things had moved into a new phase. This was no longer about a woman in the wrong seat. This was someone dismantling the mental order he had built around the uniform he wore. He took one step back, then turned as if heading toward his post. But less than 3 seconds later, he pivoted again, his eyes sharp, one foot twitching like a reflex that couldn't tolerate backing down. Finch saw it, and for the first time that morning, he took an actual step backward, not because a subordinate feared a superior, but because he knew what was about to unfold had already crossed the safe boundaries of an ordinary hearing. Brody didn't wait for any signal from her, nor did he allow the tension to stretch another second longer. He walked straight over, placing his hand on the edge of the chair as if it were an obstacle to be removed. One sharp yank made the chair jolt slightly. No warning glance, no need to issue an expulsion. In Brody's mind, that action alone conveyed the authority he believed he held, the right to decide who belonged where, who deserved to remain seated. The screech of the chair legs scraping the floor rang harsh and jarring. People nearby turned their heads, not out of concern for her, but because the sound triggered the same unease as hearing an invisible rule begin to crack. The chair didn't flip. She wasn't thrown off. But the only thing truly unsettled was the long-assumed order now being questioned in broad daylight. The woman didn't spring up, didn't argue, didn't retreat. She adjusted her posture, back rising taller, both hands resting calmly on her lap, her gaze lifting. She looked at Brody as if logging every movement he made, a pure observation, void of personal emotion. Yet it was precisely that cold composure that made Brody's hand, which had just shifted the chair, feel strangely out of place. Someone behind her quietly reached for a phone. A few others exchanged glances. No one spoke. Finch remained standing nearby, his fingers gripping his belt lightly, not out of fear, but because he couldn't understand why everything was escalating so fast. Brody kept his hand in place for a few more seconds, as if contemplating a second pull to complete the order, but she had already settled her position. The chair was no longer centered, yet the woman sitting in it had become the focal point of every eye in the room. In a courtroom not yet in session, within a space where rules were distributed by hierarchy, it was that one gesture, the shifting of a chair, that made people begin to question where authority truly resided. "You may leave peacefully," Brody said, his tone measured but unmistakably pressing. He didn't look at Finch or anyone else around him, focusing solely on the woman before him like she was a riddle with no clear solution. She didn't respond quickly, nor did she drag it out. "I do not refuse to leave because of you. I leave when I know justice no longer exists in this society." Each word landed slowly, without exclamation, without sharp glare, but everyone who heard it felt as if they were being forced to swallow a stone. That line wasn't meant as defiance. It sounded more like a declaration accidentally uttered in a confrontation no one had intended. Brody clenched his jaw, as if about to pull the chair again, but he knew every move after this would no longer be about removing an obstacle. It would become an act of war. He took a step back, then quickly returned to the posture of someone enforcing order. But his gaze remained locked on the woman, unwavering. Somewhere inside him, a question began to form, though no one dared to voice it. If pulling the chair didn't make her leave, then what would? And if nothing could make her disappear, then maybe, just maybe, he was the one who no longer belonged in that room. The judge entered from the left door, bringing instant silence to the courtroom. The hearing began with a simple assault case. Nothing controversial, no media attention. The defendants were led in, attorneys began their presentations. The crowd shifted their focus, those there for the case fixed their eyes on the bench, while the routine visitors leaned back, sighing at another drawn-out docket. The woman remained seated in the back row, her gaze steady on the attorney speaking. Brody stood to the side of the room, his shoulder resting against the wooden pillar near the exit. While Finch tried to settle into the rhythm of the hearing like usual, Brody kept his eyes on the woman. She wasn't doing anything noteworthy, just occasionally adjusting her collar, flipping the edge of a page in a small notebook, or glancing toward the judge's bench. But each movement seemed to challenge Brody, as if every subtle gesture quietly declared that he held no power over her. What bothered Brody wasn't where she sat, but that she hadn't moved when he tried to make her. Her presence didn't shrink in front of the uniform. She didn't bow her head at his reprimand, nor did she offer the kinds of apologies people usually made in hopes of staying. He walked forward, short but forceful steps, stopping directly in front of her. Without waiting for her to look up, he jabbed his finger toward the space near her face, his voice low and pressing like a threat. "This is your final warning. Get out of this area." The sentence cut through the previously calm room, prompting a few heads to turn. Some began reaching for their phones, instinctively preparing to capture the abnormal. She looked up, her eyes locking onto his face, unflinching. "Are you worried they'll hear your weakness? Or that they'll see your mistake?" Her voice wasn't loud, but each word landed heavily on the breath of those nearby. Brody clenched his fist, but didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone without a badge, without a title, without any symbol he was trained to respect. He glanced at Finch reflexively, seeking backup, but Finch stared down at his shoes, not out of avoidance, but because he didn't know how to respond when the very rules they were taught to uphold were now being warped by their superiors' actions. Brody's eyes swept the room. A few phones were raised. A few gazes had shifted not to the bench, but to him. In his mind, the concept of threat was redefined, not because she was armed, not because she resisted, but because she stood unafraid, in a place where power usually forced submission, and for Brody, a man used to wielding order to control space, that was the most alarming sign. He couldn't control the room, and even worse, he couldn't control himself when faced with someone he couldn't label. As Adrian turned back around, Brody said nothing more. He lifted his leg and kicked her square in the abdomen with the force of someone who thought he was teaching a lesson. The blow made her body jolt, lean back slightly, but she did not fall. The chair behind her crashed to the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Everyone froze, not because the kick was powerful, but because it happened in front of everyone, and it was aimed at a woman who had not lifted a hand to resist. Adrian stood still, hands resting over her stomach by reflex, eyes never leaving Brody. That moment lasted longer than the entire hearing. In that moment, the averted gazes suddenly converged. Finch took a step back, no longer able to maintain his composure. A man at the far end of the room dropped his pen, perhaps out of reflex, perhaps out of shock. A woman standing near the door clutched her son's hand tightly, deliberately turning her back, as if that would somehow lessen the severity of what had just happened. But no one left. Not a single person intervened. They chose to remain still, caught between morality and fear. She made no sound as she fell. Her hands remained on her abdomen from the pain, her face slightly tense, one foot pressed to the floor to regain balance. Her folder had slipped sideways onto the floor, pages not yet fully spilled out, but she seemed unfazed by it. Instead of scrambling to gather her things, she planted a hand down and slowly rose. The movement wasn't rushed, didn't show weakness, but took just long enough that every pair of eyes was forced to follow. Once standing, she bent down to retrieve her documents. Then she looked up. This time her eyes didn't land only on Brody. They passed over him, pausing on each person seated silently in front of the bench, on those who had pretended not to see, and those quietly recording. "And this is how you treat someone without a badge?" The question came out just loud enough to hear, but sliced through the thick air like a blade across skin. It wasn't meant for Brody alone. It was meant for everyone. And because of that, it was the moment Brody lost, despite his body remaining untouched, despite the woman before him being the one knocked to the floor. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The veins in his neck stood out, jaw clenched tight like a drawn bowstring, but his only possible reaction was to step back. Finch looked at him, then at the woman, then at the rows of seats. Everyone had seen it, and what infuriated Brody most was that he had lost control in its rawest form, reacting on impulse, without strategy, without calculation, all because of a woman unafraid to rise after being struck down. She turned back toward her original spot, not sitting again, but remaining there as if waiting for someone to speak or for someone else to walk away first. The courtroom was silent, as if someone had closed the door from the outside, but the door remained open. Only the balance inside had shifted, the stance between the one with power and the one once dismissed. And that kick, which might have seemed like nothing more than brute force, had become a moment that could not be undone in the eyes of those who once believed justice always wore blue. A murmur rose from the right-hand benches, then quickly died down, as if the speaker had just realized they had dropped a pebble into still water. An older man, gray-hailed and dressed in a neat gray suit, leaned toward the court clerk. No one heard the full sentence, but those nearby caught the first 3 words. "It's her." The clerk jolted, turned to look at him, her eyes revealing unfiltered astonishment. He gave a small nod, confirming, as if he were referring to someone cited in internal documents, not a woman who had just been kicked to the ground. He spoke at the Federal Conference on Judicial Reform. He continued, this time just loud enough for the clerk to hear. His tone carried no awe, no panic, only the bewildered cadence of someone watching the impossible unfold without needing an ID to prove it. The information spread on instinct. One attorney, arranging documents, suddenly stopped and looked up at the woman still standing. Another pulled out a phone, not to film, but to search through old case files. Someone removed their glasses, wiped their forehead, then stood without reason, simply reacting to the sense that the familiar order had begun to shift. At the bench, the judge froze mid-read. His expression changed, whether because he recognized her or because he regretted not noticing what should have been seen from the start. In a corner of the room, sunlight angled in through the window, illuminating the woman's face as if by deliberate design, though no one had touched the blinds. Meanwhile, Brody remained frozen, chest heaving, hands clenched, eyes darting between her and the responses around him. The more people stood, the more his patience thinned. He still hadn't accepted that he might be wrong, never imagined his actions would be questioned by a crowd that had always stayed silent in the face of a uniform. "I don't care who you are," he shouted, louder than before. The echo filled the room, unable to hide the panic beneath. It was no longer the command of someone in control, but the blind resistance of a man watching power slip away in utter silence. Finch glanced at him, then looked away, his lips pressed shut, eyes lowered to the floor. No one in the room affirmed Brody's words, and that silence became the clearest denial. A woman once kicked down, told to leave, now stood at the center of the room where she once had no name. She still hadn't said another word, but every movement, every upright stance without a tremor, every calm glance across the crowd without the need for emphasis spoke louder than any credential. She didn't need to show a single document. The confusion in the eyes of those who once saw her as a nobody had already done that for her. In the middle of a courtroom crowded with tense gazes and suppressed reactions, she leaned down, removed each shoe, and placed them neatly to the side. The act made no noise, triggered no dramatic response, yet the room's collective breath hitched in place. She stood barefoot, the soles of her feet pressed directly against the cold tile, unmoving despite the stares coming from every corner of the room. A woman who had been kicked, had been dragged by her chair, had been treated as an obstacle, now stood squarely in the center of a space that had never intended to welcome her. And what silenced the room was not that they understood who she was, but that they began to realize she needed no title for her presence to become undeniable. "I'm standing here not for status," she said, eyes fixed on the judge's bench where the person seated had yet to utter a single word since the hearing began, but for those whose names are never called correctly. Her words rang clear enough for everyone in the room to hear, not because of volume, but because of weight. In that moment, no one moved. Finch stood behind Brody, eyes wide, shoulders drawn tight as if braced against a post. The older man in the gray suit had already taken a seat, though his hands still gripped the armrests. A female attorney quietly turned off her phone, resting one palm gently over the other as if to steady herself. None of them had imagined Brody's kick would lead to this moment. No one foresaw how an act so normalized by enforcement logic could become a mirror reflecting the entire way power operated in their system. Brody's eyes were fixed on her bare feet, as if that image alone had stripped away his final layer of defense. He said nothing more. The anger was still there, but it had nowhere to land. He knew that any further words would only deepen his fall into the role of someone who had lost control. Her shoes lay beneath the bench, directly in his line of sight, like a reminder that some things cannot be stepped over without leaving a trace. From the front, the judge leaned toward the microphone but did not speak. Something in the air held him back. At that moment, every word risked becoming a mistake. Meanwhile, Finch remained behind Brody, his gaze drifting for the first time from the woman to the courtroom. Those who once scoffed were no longer making eye contact. A few looked down, not out of shame, but because they no longer knew where to look. And then, for the first time since morning, Brody took a step back on his own. He gave no order, said nothing to Finch, didn't pretend to assess the room. He simply stepped backward. And that single retreat, brief as it was, resounded louder than any command he had ever used to assert control. She remained standing, and by removing her shoes, by choosing not to act in the name of a title, she had forced the entire room to redefine what authority looked like. Without an introduction, she made everyone still. And from that moment on, the order in the courtroom no longer belonged to the ones in uniform. The first clip that surfaced on social media lasted only 11 seconds. But its aftershocks lingered for days. The silent recording captured the exact moment Brody kicked the woman squarely in the stomach, sending her to the ground, caught the sound of wood tipping over, then subtly panned to show her rising amid a silence no one dared to break. No one stepped into frame to intervene. Everyone around, both civilians and legal personnel, was caught frozen in place. The final frame of the video appeared against a black background. Pale white but striking. She did not flinch. What held viewers captive was not the kick itself, but the steady, grounded gaze of the woman as she stood back up. She did not look around for help. She did not show pain. She simply stood, gathered her documents, lifted her head, and left behind a silence that drowned the entire room. Within just 2 hours of its posting, tens of thousands of shares had spread the video across all platforms. Many initially assumed it was a mishandled local hearing, but the accompanying caption shifted everything. State governor kicked to the floor by police officer in courtroom. In front of 30 witnesses, no one spoke up. The media could not ignore it. CNN covered the story at 9 in the morning, opening with a frozen frame of her standing, eyes fixed on the bench. The anchor hesitated before saying her name, as if even he had not yet accepted that it was real. NPR quickly published a piece titled, "The Nameless Woman in Court. Turns out she holds the power of the state." Al Jazeera was more direct. When a governor gets kicked down, which system will stand up? The shock did not stem from her identity, but from the fact that no one in the clip intervened. 30 people witnessed it, and 30 stayed silent. Those who once believed justice resided in the very building they worked in began to ask if they were part of that silence. No one thought an ordinary assault at the county level would become a national flashpoint just because the victim held one of the highest offices in the state. But what unsettled people most was not her position. It was her composure after the kick. With just 11 seconds of footage, the image of an ordinary woman shoved aside and walking herself back to the center shattered old assumptions about who deserves to be heard. A wave of hashtags followed. She did not flinch, witnessed but silent. Name her right. People did not just want to know who she was, they wanted to understand why a governor had to stand barefoot in court while no one stepped up to defend her. In newsrooms, reporters began combing through past cases overlooked because the victim had no title, no camera, or no correctly spelled name in the record. In classrooms, teachers played the clip for discussion, and in the halls of several police departments, the atmosphere grew unusually heavy, because if someone like her could be kicked to the ground inside a courtroom, then who else had it happened to how many times, when no one filmed it, and no one stood. Not long after the television networks simultaneously broke the news, a wave of media outlets flooded the governor's office with interview requests. They wanted to confirm the identity of the woman in the video, to capture her voice firsthand, to probe every detail from her expressions to her decision to remain silent. A few editors even proposed live broadcasts where she could say, "Speak for those who were once silent." But no one was granted access. The office door remained open as usual, staff continued receiving visitors, but every question related to the incident was redirected to the internal inbox. And then, a single-line statement was released. "I did not fall, but the system should consider what it's standing on." The message appeared on plain white paper, default font, as if anyone could have typed it, yet no one else had the standing to make it matter in that precise moment. And that timing was exactly what made the sentence powerful enough to need no repetition. The public response did not wait for further comment. They created their resonance. On social media, people began sharing the moment she stood up, overlaying it with the statement's words. Some paired the kick with footage of past incidents where victims were never asked their names. Political analysts started debating. Did the system collapse alongside that woman, or had it already been tilted too far without anyone bothering to notice? In a suburban town nearly 200 miles from the capital, a retired police officer quietly dialed his daughter. She was in her second year at the Federal Police Academy, the same institution where he had taught for 15 years before switching careers. The call was brief. Just a message. "If you ever believed reflexes save lives," he said, "remember, one day they might kill your honor." The line didn't come from any textbook. It was the product of a night spent rewatching the 11-second clip. So many times he memorized even the camera's tremble. What startled him wasn't the kick. It was how the young officer beside it didn't move. It was the faces of those in the courtroom, not indifferent but paralyzed. Everyone is frozen, held in place by an invisible thread called roll. That night, he sat in a small kitchen, a dim light above, hands around a cold cup of tea, eyes fixed on the glow still spilling from the local precinct onto the sidewalk. He hadn't thought he'd ever call his daughter again to talk about duty, but tonight he knew silence wasn't an option. Some lessons can't be left for people to learn too late, and he knew if any young officer saw that woman's eyes again, they'd have to ask themselves, "If I were there, would I have kicked, looked away, or stepped forward and done what's right?" There were no protests that night, but thousands of questions began to echo quietly. And what frightened those in power most was when those questions started coming from inside the system. This was no longer the noise of outsiders. It was the first crack from those who once believed they stood on the right side. News of the woman's true identity in the viral clip had not yet settled when a new wave began to rise. An anonymous account uploaded a document over 20 pages long, marked Unprocessed Internal Report. Inside, Brody's name appeared repeatedly. The first line of the file made even the most indifferent readers pause and read slowly. Officer Brody has received 9 official complaints over the past 7 years. The poster did not reveal their position or place of work. However, the stamps, case numbers, and formatting were entirely consistent with federal police records. Soon after, an independent verification by an investigative journalism organization confirmed that most complaints involved unnecessary use of force, with the majority of victims being women of color, detained or restrained in non-threatening situations. Online communities began tracing each case. A woman from West Monroe had posted in 2018 about being shoved when she asked to speak with a lawyer. Another from Monroe City recalled being handcuffed in a parking lot for not presenting full documentation. All these stories, once seen as isolated, buried under administrative language, suddenly connected into a pattern. Brody was not a lone incident emerging from a sudden mistake. He was the result of a system too used to sweeping misconduct under the rug instead of addressing its root. Among the leaked documents was a list of cases marked closed internally. Each line included a date, the complainant's name, the reason for the complaint, and a final note. Nearly all ended with phrases like, insufficient evidence, resolved internally, explained to the party involved, or no basis for prosecution. Some lines were blurred, only half legible. Some names were redacted, some statements incomplete, and some notes handwritten. The complainant was asked to sign a withdrawal form. It was the phrase "signed" that triggered the strongest backlash. Many began sharing personal experiences with police where they had been pressured to retract their complaints. One woman commented, "I didn't sign because I believed it was resolved. I signed because I was held at the station for 7 hours and wasn't allowed to make a call." That line was quoted thousands of times as living proof of how the concept of justice had fractured from within. She, the woman who had been kicked, made no public comment about the leaked documents. But from that moment, the story was no longer about one individual. It pointed to a deeper reality. How many more Brodies were out there? And how many more complaint records would be blurred out with the phrase, handled internally? A local paper wrote in its editorial the next morning, "We don't need more proof of the victim's existence. We need proof that the process to protect them exists." And that remained the most pressing question hanging in the air, not directed at Brody, but at the entire system that had shielded him from facing the truth. The police department's response came later that afternoon during a hastily arranged press conference outside headquarters. A spokesperson in a tidy suit stood behind the microphone and read slowly, "We understand the public's concern. However, it is not possible to verify all past complaints without sufficient legal grounds." A statement that seemed harmless, yet only deepened the public's outrage. People did not need the police to verify every complaint. They just wanted an acknowledgement that those complaints had once existed. Online, the phrase, "unable to verify," became the headline for a series of articles, comments, and political cartoons. A major news outlet wrote, "Since when does justice require conditions to verify wrongdoing?" At the same time, social organizations began sharing independent data on the percentage of complaints rejected for investigation over the past 10 years. Among thousands of figures, one line made many choke. Nearly 80% of complaints about abuse of power against women of color were not fully pursued. The police department tried to ease the tension with a second statement, softer in tone, filled with phrases like "currently reviewing," "will cooperate fully," and "hope the public maintains trust." But the effect was nearly zero. When someone is kicked down inside a courtroom and no one intervenes, asking people to keep faith sounds like a joke. And when past victims started speaking out, not all at once, not loudly, but through brief shared posts and old messages resurfacing, no apology carried any weight. In this context, she did not appear publicly. She was seen entering a closed-door meeting with the state cabinet, a space usually reserved for strategic talks or emergencies. She brought no documents, no legal counsel, wearing only a dark outfit and holding a folded piece of paper. According to an insider, when asked what she wanted from the meeting, she did not speak of Brody. She made no demands for compensation, apology, or media response. She simply placed the paper on the table, lifted her head, and said slowly, "I want a list of those who were denied a voice." The room fell silent. No one asked for clarification because everyone understood. Those denied a voice was not a metaphor. It was a list of victims who had come forward, spoken, filed complaints, but received no response. A legislator recalled after the meeting, "She didn't need to raise her voice." That sentence cut straight to the core of all of us. It wasn't about demanding rights for herself, but forcing the whole system to confront what it had tried to forget. From that moment, the crisis was no longer about handling one officer. It had entered a new phase. How would that system respond when people demanded back the voices that had been taken away? The next morning, the phrase "denied list" appeared across major newspapers, accompanied by the tagline, "When someone does not speak up for herself but dares to demand the right to speak for others, that is no longer a personal reaction. That is the beginning of change." Just 3 days after Adrian's quiet statement at the cabinet meeting, a flood of petitions began pouring into the governor's office. These were not new complaints, but rewritten versions of old cases previously classified as insufficient for investigation or handled internally. Each line was living proof that past silence was not due to lack of voice, but because no one listened. Now, Adrienne did not need to appear on television or call for action. Her calm presence in the courtroom, followed by a single demand sent to the cabinet, accomplished what an entire generation of human rights lawyers had never done. It made those who had given up willing to speak again. An official confirmed that more than 300 petitions were submitted within the first 24 hours. They included handwritten letters, emails, scanned documents, and even a handwritten notebook from 7 years ago, where people had once recorded their reports, but were persuaded not to make a fuss. Names began to emerge on the lists, not case numbers, but real people, real incidents, and real pain. Adrienne did not require anyone to recount details. She appointed an independent team to visit each region, listen without interruption or rushed judgment, so those people could tell their full stories once in a lifetime. The pressure did not stop there. An article in The Atlantic directly questioned if abuse of power is taught as a reflex, who is to blame? That question targeted what was once seen as a security training cradle, the State Police Academy. For years, it had boasted a rapid response program, training cadets to decide in less than 2 seconds. But when the kick that toppled a chair in the courtroom was proven to be a product of that reflex, the program was immediately put under scrutiny. An internal video leaked from last year's training showed a former instructor saying, "In doubtful situations, act first, explain later." In an age filled with cameras and surveillance, that statement was seen as ruthless. Law students began speaking out, many questioning the legality and ethics of teaching a kill or be killed mindset, disguised as survival training. A female student wrote on social media, "If survival means reacting as if everyone is the enemy, then this is not protecting citizens. It is preparing to control them." The public did not demand the program's complete abolition, but they demanded transparency. Citizens wanted to know, was the reflex Brody exhibited that day an individual act, or was it programmed into the system? And if it was the system, who wrote that code? Under this pressure, the Academy was forced to hold an open hearing where instructors, students, and social experts gathered to analyze the boundary between reflex and conscience. Adrienne was absent from the hearing. Yet a vacant chair reserved in the front row bore her name, not for her position, but because of her resolute silence, which forced a training program once seen as an untouchable standard to finally look inward. In a society that once believed rapid action was the only way to protect security, people were beginning to understand one thing: justice without time for reflection is nothing more than legalized violence. The handwritten letter from the retired commander spread faster than any Saturday morning editorial. Without a red stamp or publication in mainstream newspapers, the letter first appeared on a small forum of former police veterans. Yet its opening line made thousands pause. "I was not fired. I resigned because I no longer wished to wear a badge polished by silence." The writer, a former commander who had worked directly with Brody, recounted the last time he saw him shove a black woman out of the interrogation room for sitting in the wrong seat. He stood less than 10 steps away but did nothing. "I did not hit her, but I also did not step in. And that silence was the deepest bow I have ever made in my life." The letter did not mention Adrienne even once. It made no call to rename streets or reclaim honor. It was simply a confession addressed to the new generation of police officers with a warning: don't learn how to climb the system. Learn how not to let it crush others without anyone speaking up. The letter was shared by several training academy students and within 3 days became an unofficial document instructors used to discuss ethics in public service classes. At the same time, the organizers of the Justice Parade, scheduled at Federal Square, announced the list of honored guests. Adrienne Rowe's name was prominently placed at the center, where the keynote speaker was usually featured. But she refused all speeches. No stepping onto the stage, no remote video statements, only a blank sheet of paper with a handwritten line in blue ink, delivered by her assistant the day before the event. Do not call my name. Listen to those without name. That paper was affixed to the podium, with no one replacing her. Throughout the parade, the resonance did not come from slogans or the marching band. What lingered was the moment when participants collectively observed a minute of silence. No one spoke, yet many looked around at unfamiliar faces, at shirts without badges. A little girl held a sign that read, "My father was once handcuffed without being asked his name." A young woman wearing a nurse's uniform sported a fake name tag, "Victim number 36." The rest were long lines of handwritten phrases, unprinted and unstyled. I was also kicked out of my seat. When that day ended, no speeches were broadcast on television. However, the organizers received thousands of thank you emails, not because of the event's success, but because for the first time people participated in a memorial where no one was forced to stand before a microphone to prove they deserved to be heard. Adrienne had yet to reappear publicly. The governor's office declined to comment on her activities during this time. However, a cabinet insider confirmed that each week she spent 2 evenings meeting privately with those whose complaints had been dismissed, not to reopen cases, but to listen to their stories from the beginning, for the first time with their full names. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and held no new titles. But from that very silence, something else was growing, not the image of a leader, but the echo of a stance. The stance of one who did not demand a voice for herself, but paved the way for the voices of thousands to emerge. A special hearing was held in the main chamber of the state capitol on a Tuesday afternoon, attended by more than 30 legislators and representatives from agencies related to law enforcement. The announced topic was behavioral reflex or biased reflex, an academic-sounding question that forced the entire system to reconsider the roots of what they once regarded as professional instinct. The signage in the room did not list witnesses as usual. The guest list was stripped of details. The woman appeared in the front row with no title attached, introduced without biography or position. Adrienne sat facing the entire council. When invited to speak, she replied, "I am here to answer, not to testify to emotions." The first question from an elder legislator was, "In your opinion, what should police reflex actions be based on?" She answered, "On principles, not skin color." A brief response without explanation, but enough to prompt the moderator to pause for 2 minutes before moving on. Some council members expected her to use the opportunity to harshly criticize law enforcement or propose sweeping reforms. But Adrienne did not. She continued answering each question as if inspecting every crack in an old wall with her gaze. When asked about the incident with Brody, she did not mention his name. She said, "I did not go there to challenge anyone. I went to sit in the rightful place in the courtroom and observe how the system reacts to someone without a badge." A young legislator stood, voice trembling, "If you could choose again, what would you do differently?" She looked directly at him, paused for a few seconds, then said, "I wouldn't choose again. I want the system to be a place where no one has to calculate before stepping into the courtroom." Throughout the 3-hour hearing, she did not recount the shocking details previously aired on television. She did not describe the moment she was kicked out of her seat, nor repeat old statements. This surprised many, but it was precisely her restraint that made people pay more attention to what she was implying. An Asian American legislator concluded the hearing with a brief remark, "This is the first time I have heard a rebuttal without a voice louder than necessary." When the hearing ended, Adrienne stood. Some delegates rose to see her out, while others continued taking notes on her testimony. A technical staff member whispered to a colleague, "I expected her to be angrier." The other replied, almost as a warning, "She doesn't need to be angry." The whole room saw itself shaking before someone who never raised her voice. That evening, news reports did not quote Adrienne's words. They only posted a single photo. A woman standing in the meeting room, hands lightly clasped in front of her stomach, eyes fixed straight ahead. The caption read simply, "A woman who needs no business card to reset the questions for an entire system." The atmosphere in the state capitol chamber after the hearing thickened. as if everyone was trying to swallow something stuck in their throat. In the center seat, a seasoned member known for his cold demeanor raised his hand to speak last before adjournment. He rose slowly, holding the edge of the table, eyes directed at where Adrienne had sat. His voice was not loud, but carried far enough for those at the back to look up. "I have watched that clip 7 times over 2 nights," he began. "And each time I realized I was closing my eyes right at the moment the kick happened." He paused, voice breaking. "But what chokes me is not seeing a woman knocked down, but seeing the law itself bent, right before our eyes, with no one standing up to fix it." That moment seemed to suspend the room in stillness. No pen tapping, no phone ringing, no one dared glance at their neighbor. Only the heavy silence of a system reflecting on itself. The moderator quickly nodded in thanks and declared the hearing adjourned. Yet the most important part happened afterward, not in documents but in the hallways, where young civil servants passed by. Someone hastily wrote on the duty board near the elevator, "The reflex of one person is not as frightening as the reflex of a system." The ink was still wet, the paper slightly curled from humidity, but no one took it down. A security officer walking by paused for a few seconds, then straightened his posture as he moved on. The message about that phrase spread rapidly within the government. A legislative advisor sent a photo to their HR team with the note, "This might be where change begins." An intern photographed it to use as a thesis topic on organizational response to ethical crises. In the following hours, the phrase was reprinted, shared, and appeared on the white walls of several meeting rooms, unsigned, without calls to action. At the governor's office, Adrienne made no mention of it. She was meeting with the policy team on a behavioral reform package for officer training. On the table lay a 5-page plan, but at the top of the first page she had handwritten a line. "All reflexes must be relearned, starting with the courage to look at oneself." An assistant noticed, jotted it down in a notebook, but said nothing. They understood that what was happening needed no rhetorical explanation, nor should it be trapped in flowery language. That afternoon, the Capitol building was no more radiant, with no sign that an important hearing had taken place. But there was a very small, very real change. More doors left open. More small groups whispering not about legislative outcomes, but about what had been left unsaid for years. And among hallways once filled with hurried footsteps, there were now slower steps, as if each person was beginning to relearn how to move past old reflexes, not to break the system, but to make it sober enough to see itself. An internal email was sent 3 weeks before the unexpected trial leaked to the press. In it, a court office staffer named Rochelle Marks informed her superior that the woman in the gray shirt attending as an observer is Adrienne Rowe, the state governor. Instead of reporting this to security or notifying the coordination team, she received a one little reply: "Do nothing, let the process handle it." That seemingly harmless response later became the center of a public storm because it allowed a wrongful act to proceed through the system unchecked. The email copy first appeared on a forum for former court employees. Within 6 hours, it spread to Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook groups that monitor law enforcement insiders. The earliest comments all focused on one point. Would that kick have happened if Adrienne's identity had been public from the start? A simple question that struck directly at the belief the system had long tried to build, that justice remains steady regardless of rank, status, or identity, and especially that who you are does not determine fair treatment. On television, legal experts began to split into camps. Some defended the principle of equal process, arguing that everyone entering a courtroom is treated the same, no matter their background or title. But the majority disagreed, pointing out that this assumption led Brody to believe he could act with impunity towards someone he thought was nobody. A veteran commentator said on an evening broadcast, "When a system chooses silence, it does not protect fairness, it protects power that has misjudged its people. The question raised went beyond Adrienne's case. It extended to hundreds of past cases dismissed because the victims lacked enough voice or a reputation that commanded respect. In a Washington Post article, journalist Meredith Lane cited numerous instances ignored due to a lack of legitimate identification, concluding, "The process is not indifferent. It simply reflects the feelings of those who created it." At the governor's office, Adrienne made no mention of the leaked email. But in a meeting with her communications team, she posed a single question. If tomorrow 10 more people like me entered a courtroom, would they survive the trial? The room fell silent. No one answered. Perhaps no one needed to, because at that moment they understood the problem was not about identity. It was about the system's reaction when faced with someone who had nothing to be recognized by. Days later, some courts in the state began piloting a declared free attendance model, allowing participants to attend without disclosing their name or title. It was not a complete solution, but a first step toward a crucial change, forcing the system to judge people by their actions, not their labels. And, if sustained, that kick would be more than a personal violation. It would mark the start of rewriting what once seemed an immutable concept, procedure. When pressed by reporters after a closed-door meeting, Adrienne neither avoided nor expanded. "My identity matters less than a person's dignity." That statement was not an explanation. It was a period, placed exactly where misguided debates should end. Those who tried to force her to confirm rank, position, or past had to confront a simpler reality. Brody's act would not be any less wrong if the victim were an ordinary citizen, nor more condemnable if the victim were a governor. The story's focus was never status. It was ethics. While the media still churned over the leaked email, the document signer, a staffer named Louis Mallard, was suspended pending an internal investigation. But public reaction took a different turn. On forums, radio shows, and political live streams, no one targeted Louis with anger. No one called his name with fury or demanded harsh punishment. Instead, public discourse raised a deeper, harsher question. Who designed the system that forced Louis to choose silence? The issue was no longer just about one email. It began to uncover a deeper, hidden side. The entire administrative system within the court was operating defensively, choosing safety over right or wrong, prioritizing protecting the institution over protecting people. A law professor at Stanford University wrote in a commentary published in The Atlantic, "We are facing a type of institutional reflex. When risk rises, the system contracts, wrapping itself in rules and procedures to avoid accountability rather than seek justice." The crowds coming to community dialogues grew larger. Among them were former legal professionals, students, and even former victims, whose complaints had been dismissed for lack of investigatory elements. They came not only to tell their stories, but to question how many errors have been labeled "handled internally." How many people were denied a chance to explain simply because their files did not fit the default evaluation framework? And when will the system admit that sometimes the fault lies in the way it was built? Adrienne did not speak at any of these dialogues. She still arrived on time at the office, continued cabinet meetings as usual, and declined all invitations for honorary speeches. But whenever someone mentioned the woman who was kicked during the hearing, what everyone remembered was not her title, but how she stood up after the fall, without blame, without anger, asking only one question that silenced the entire system. Is this how you treat someone without a badge? Louis Mallard was later reinstated to his former position. He made no public statements. Yet he sent a handwritten letter to Adrienne that read simply, "Next time, if I must choose between silence and speaking out, I will choose what is right, even if I am not allowed." The story did not end there. But from that moment on, no one dared consider silence a harmless default. And in many policy meetings thereafter, a small item began to be added at the end of coordination documents. Identity does not guarantee dignity. Right response is what must be preserved. Brody was tried in federal court in a trial broadcast live across multiple national platforms. The defendant's seat became the focal point of a wave of outrage. The indictment included 3 charges: assault, abuse of power while on duty, and discriminatory misconduct with bias at a public venue. Witnesses testified one by one, from court clerks, observing lawyers, to security personnel. All confirmed that Brody acted violently without any provocation. The 11-second clip played in court was just the surface. The prosecutor pointed out the submerged part, a long history of complaints and a covering-up system. In his final defense, Brody looked up, his voice hoarse but still stubborn. "I thought she was just an ordinary person." The statement struck back like a slap. The courtroom seemed to freeze, not out of shock, but because that answer exposed the deep nature of the deviation, that an officer viewed someone's ordinary identity as sufficient reason to unleash violence. The prosecution needed no lengthy speech. One sentence was delivered decisively and coldly. "So, if it wasn't the governor you were allowed to kick?" Each word cut like a knife, stripping away the veneer of excuses. At that moment, even the defense attorney remained silent. The core issue was exposed not through legal reasoning, but by an ethical principle. A citizen is a citizen, regardless of office held. The courtroom fell into suffocating silence. Only the faint echoes of truth rose through every question. What made an officer believe he had the right to hit someone as long as that person bore no badge? How many violent acts had been ignored because the victim lacked the status to be protected? And how long before the system admits that a victim's inviolable rights do not depend on title, but on dignity? The verdict came after 1 hour of deliberation. The court found Brody guilty of all 3 charges with no mitigating circumstances. He faced a federal prison sentence. But the greater impact was outside the courtroom. Civil oversight groups began proposing new legislation. All uses of force in public would be independently reviewed, regardless of the victim's rank. A congressman posted on social media, "It is time for the law to stop weighing backgrounds before protecting a human being." Adrienne was not present in court. She followed the trial via internal broadcasts, but at day's end, a reporter captured her leaving the governor's office, pausing briefly before a public notice board where a white paper bore bold letters, "If a citizen can be kicked without cause, then who among us is truly safe?" And it was that silent presence that made the story resonate more powerfully than any speech. The sentence against Brody was pronounced at 11 in the morning in a trial attended by full media representation, civil organizations, and many citizens who had followed the case from the start. 3 years in prison, a lifetime ban from public service, and a requirement to compensate the victim for emotional damages. Yet, unlike many trials ending with applause or chants for justice, that courtroom remained solemn. As the judge read the last line of the sentence, many eyes no longer looked at Brody. They scanned the room, seemingly asking themselves, "Is this the true beginning of real change, or just a temporary patch over a deep crack?" Some bowed their heads, not in shame, but in realization. The truth lay not in the 3 years, but in the bigger question. How many victims never reached trial because they were not important enough to make way? Adrienne stood up just as the judge declared the session closed. She walked out of the courtroom without leaving any statement. Her gray shirt, hair neatly tied at the nape, and calm gaze all seemed unchanged since her first appearance. But this time, what was different was the attitude of those she passed by. No one lowered their heads, pretending to check their phones, nor did anyone feign distraction. One by one, they slowed down, their eyes following her as an untrained reflex awakened by what they had witnessed. A young staff member from the Community Justice Office silently stood at attention without a word as Adrienne approached. An elderly woman sitting in the back row wiped away a tear, not from emotion, but perhaps because, for the first time, she saw someone once regarded as vulnerable step out of a door without being pushed, ignored, or erased. It was a moment that needed no words. The hallway atmosphere remained as usual, steady and calm. Yet something had changed. A group of legal interns passed by, discussing lessons from the case. One of them said, It seems justice begins with how we observe the treatment of a person before knowing who they are. The words were not loud or meant to impress, but they lingered longer than the verdict just announced. Adrienne left the courthouse without looking back, yet each step she took marked something that had just ended, and something else quietly beginning, and those who witnessed it this time no longer remained silent out of habit. They had learned to pause, not to act, but to listen to something they had never dared to notice before, the presence of a human being. At the Federal Police Academy, a quiet but thorough transformation began. The training curriculum, once regarded as foundational for future officers, was reviewed line by line. The section titled Survival Priority Reflex, which emphasized immediate action when feeling threatened, was removed from the mandatory program. In its place, a new module was introduced: Dignity, Power, the Ethical Line. This was not merely a linguistic adjustment, but a complete philosophical shift from individual survival reflexes to collective social awareness. The first class under the new program began with an 11-second video. In the frame, a woman was kicked from her chair during a trial. The young instructor posed a question, not to test knowledge but to shock consciousness. Why is a person sitting still, neither threatening nor resisting, kicked? The room fell silent. Some cadets furrowed their brows, a few took notes, but no one raised a hand. The question required no theoretical answer. It forced a personal reflection before responding correctly. The instructor that day was a former internal affairs investigator who had witnessed Brody's prosecution. He did not read slides or quote laws. He recounted the moment the courtroom fell silent when Adrienne walked by and asked, "Why does that silence weigh more than the verdict?" One cadet wrote it was the first time they understood that authority lies not in holding a gun, but in knowing when to stop. A week later, the Academy's internal newsletter sent a brief excerpt to every inbox, no source cited, no commentary attached. It contained only one line: "If you don't know why someone was kicked, don't learn how to kick right. Learn how not to harm if it's not justified." The phrase spread like a non-compulsory reminder, but was enough to reach a new generation of officers raised in an era where reputation and power often came with a motto to protect oneself first. In the behavioral reflex lab, once used to simulate acute danger scenarios, new scenarios were introduced. Gone were roles involving weapons or shouting. Instead, ambiguous situations emerged, such as a woman with a purse sitting at the courthouse reception. The question shifted from "how do you react when attacked" to "do you know where the ethical boundary lies before you act?" This reframing compelled trainees to realize that danger does not lie in hesitation, but in haste rationalized by professionalism. In the main hall of the academy, a blackboard retained the exact phrase from the first lecture. It was neither erased after class nor dared to be altered. The kick that made her fall is not the kick itself, but the reflex permitted by the silence of those who once studied here. No one signed it, but those who understood knew this was not just a new training course, but the start of a generation of police officers beginning with a question instead of an order. A black and white photo framed in dark wood hung on the main wall of the theory classroom. In the photo, a woman stood straight amid an overturned chair, wearing simple clothes, her gaze not directed at the camera. Around her were astonished looks, some turning away, some clutching briefcases as if holding on to old patterns. The photo bore no caption, no timestamp, no photographer's name. Only a small serif font line read, "She needs no introduction," and that was enough. That phrase quickly became one of the most frequently noted in cadets' notebooks. No one was required to write it down. No one was forced to memorize it, but it stuck in their minds as a warning sign. In an environment where every title was ranked by rank, seniority, or administrative power, the presence of a person needing no title carried greater influence than all of them. A second-year cadet, once a top performer in rapid response simulations, was the first to speak when asked for impressions after class. He said little, whispering as if a reflection aloud, "If one kick can rewrite the entire curriculum, Maybe we learned it wrong before." The remark was not included in the meeting minutes, nor posted on bulletin boards, yet it spread in hallways, during breaks between training sessions, and eventually appeared on the backs of some personal lecture notes. The main instructor of the class, a former police chief who had served in 3 different states, heard that remark while walking down the hallway. She stopped, did not ask for the name of the student who spoke, nor did she correct the statement with any theoretical framing. Instead, she dedicated the next lesson to posing an open question. What causes a wrong reflex? Is it instinct, or the way we have been taught to believe we are right? The question took the class more than 10 minutes before someone raised their hand. In a corner of the room, the whiteboard still displayed the emergency response behavior diagram, with arrows connecting actions and consequences. But now, a new branch was added, one not in the original diagram: ethical awareness before action. This branch was neither highlighted nor central, but it gradually became the starting point for all situational analyses, because they understood that without defining limits before reacting, even correct procedural steps could cause irreversible harm. Many instructors who had opposed curriculum changes began to silently observe. They did not admit fault, but no longer insisted that reflex behavior was a necessary self-defense mechanism. Some started consulting sociological studies on power and implicit bias, borrowing theories from outside the field to supplement their lectures. This was unprecedented in the past 2 decades. Adrian's photo, though no one publicly named her, became a new kind of symbol. It did not carry the legend of a heroine, nor was it tied to achievements or medals. Each student who looked at the photo was reminded of one thing: reflexes cannot be an excuse to forget the dignity of others. And the more one remains silent amid a crisis, the more it forces others to pause and reconsider what once seemed obvious. In a semester-end summary, when students were asked to write down the 3 most important lessons they learned, most did not choose techniques or engagement principles. They chose phrases like ethical limits, responsibility beyond titles, and response after understanding who the other person is. And some, instead of writing content, pasted a small copy of the photo in the corner of the page. That was how they remembered the lesson, not through words, but through an image that never spoke, yet made an entire system listen. When the first directives from the governor's office were issued, many local police departments felt caught off guard. The documents demanded a comprehensive review of all complaint files with 3 or more reports, especially those involving abuse of power or discrimination. Cases previously dismissed due to lack of evidence were now forwarded directly to an independent committee for thorough re-examination. This approach unsettled many in the force, not out of fear of exposure, but because they were forced to confront practices once considered normal. In a small southern county, a police chief with over 20 years of experience submitted his resignation. He did not wait for an investigation nor cited health or transfer reasons. His brief letter stated, "Not because I was wrong, but because I ignored too many wrongs." Originally sent only to his direct superiors, the letter somehow leaked online. Within 24 hours, numerous professional forums debated the true meaning of a timely withdrawal. Some saw it as avoidance, but most acknowledged that only those who have fought the silence fully understand the cost of staying. Reviews no longer relied on personal defenses or internal reports from direct supervisors. An independent tracing system was established, with access to data from multiple sources: civilian complaints, internal records, and even anonymous staff reports. This process reopened many cases thought to be closed. Victims who had filed complaints 3 times without ever being interviewed suddenly received invitations from state investigators. Many wept holding these letters, not out of comfort, but from realizing they were never truly forgotten. At a confidential meeting among regional commanders, one asked, "If an officer with 5 complaints is still promoted, who's at fault?" The question went unanswered, but it began shaking a system accustomed to inherited routines. Performance evaluations, once based on case counts or obedience, were reconsidered. A new proposal emerged: Investigative outcomes and community trust ratings would become joint factors in personnel assessments. This change led to many departures, some due to new public pressures, others recognizing misalignment with evolving leadership. Yet in this void, a new generation rose, those once in subordinate roles, now empowered to reform from within. Former complaint clerks, previously data entry workers, were now tasked with evaluating supervisory response quality. This shift exposed weaknesses in previously solid processes. A senior security academy instructor wrote in a professional journal, "If a brick cracks, you replace it. But if the foundation was built on silence, you must tear down the entire base." His words were not direct criticism, but guidance for those rebuilding. What mattered most, he said, was not the speed of change, but the courage to face how the force once tolerated harm without gunfire or scars to recognize it. As the new system rolled out broadly, the atmosphere at precincts visibly shifted. Achievement walls now include community trust indices. Briefings began featuring local citizen representatives sharing feedback. Surprisingly, some veteran officers who had fiercely opposed reopening old files voluntarily joined advisory groups to restore faith in the very institution they once distrusted. Ultimately, no one wished to leave under pressure to bow their heads. They wanted to depart knowing they had done the right thing. The debate over security sector reform began to intensify when some conservative politicians voiced opposition. On national television, a long-serving senator stated, "If we always have to check whether the person we face holds a position before acting, then who would dare enforce the law?" Though this remark received applause from many allies, it immediately sparked a strong backlash from the public. Civil groups, human rights organizations, and even some veteran officers argued that the statement was not only misleading, but also insulting to victims who had been assaulted because they were deemed not important enough. The debate spread to training schools, legislative councils, and the media. People began to clearly take sides. One camp claimed the reforms had gone too far, hindering professional reflexes. The other countered that if those reflexes were based on prejudice, then change was necessary. Many social scholars spoke up, citing psychological studies linking unchecked power to tendencies of abuse. A researcher who had worked with the Federal Police Academy emphasized, "What they call a reflex for self-defense is sometimes the product of training that nurtures bias without awareness." In that context, Adrienne Rowe, once the focal point of the ethics inquiry, remained silent. At a statewide online conference organized by the Justice Reform Committee, she appeared simply as a participant, without a leading role or introduction. The camera lingered on her frame for several seconds. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the screen, pen in hand, taking continuous notes. No excessive expressions, no suggestive gestures. The entire conference seemed to pause in that moment, as if every argument suddenly felt redundant before a person who had directly endured the consequences of what was being debated. Her presence, though unaccompanied by speech, became a message, stronger than any words. On social media, screenshots from the meeting, showing Adrienne looking straight ahead, neither bowing nor turning away, spread as a new symbol of resistance through silence. One comment read, "Among those shouting to defend the old ways, there is one who sits quietly, listening to everything, then amends it through action." Within government agencies, Adrienne's silence became an ethical litmus test. Some media advisors suggested the governor leverage that image to bolster the reform strategy. Yet her reaction prevented the campaign from becoming mere propaganda. A member of the cabinet secretariat privately noted, "She does not need to win debates. She only needs to ensure that no one gets beaten again for lacking the status to be spared." As public opinion continued to polarize, those in the middle began to choose sides. They could no longer support professional reflexes while ignoring the consequences those reflexes had caused. A police representative from a western city stated at a subsequent hearing, "I used to think reflexes helped us survive, but now I realize if they harm innocent people, they are no longer instincts, they are dangerous habits in disguise." In that atmosphere, Adrienne Rowe continued attending meetings, still calm and composed, still taking meticulous notes. still not seizing the microphone. Yet that very composure forced many legislators to weigh their words more carefully, because every time the camera panned to that woman, they faced not only the gaze of their constituents, but also a mirror reflecting what the system had once rejected. And sometimes, awakening does not have to be loud. It begins with a gaze that does not look away. A cascade of reactions emerged from society's quiet layers, sparking an unexpected wave. In an old package sent to the governor's office, a handwritten letter faded in purple ink was found, its slanted, neat script characteristic of an earlier generation. The letter came from Eleanor Griffith, 82 years old, who had worked as a courthouse janitor in the Southern District for 30 years. She requested nothing, demanded no reply. She simply recounted a morning 20 years prior when an officer shoved her out of the courthouse hallway for blocking official duties. She did not resist. No one returned, and the incident was quickly buried. Watching you walk out of that courtroom with your back straight, it felt like time was being rewound, she wrote. I was never believed, but now you stand for people like me. The letter was never publicized, nor became a hashtag, but was laminated and posted on the second-floor hall bulletin board of the government building, a reminder that politics does not start on the podium, but from unhealed memory. At the policy level, a group of experts was convened to review all administrative forms related to scholarships, civil service employment, and legal sector recruitment. During cross-checking, a long-standing and contentious item was found. Have you ever been subject to administrative action by the police? This question has excluded many young people, especially people of color, from opportunities over baseless warnings. Under pressure from educational and civil society organizations, this item was removed from the state scholarship application after a closed session by the Education Coordination Council. A council member privately shared that the decision was not driven by public opinion, but by the belief that no one should carry the burden of a system's wrongdoing just because they were victims. The updated form was widely distributed to universities, accompanied by a small note at the bottom. Evaluation criteria will exclude bias related to past incidents without conviction. Though small, this change meant a fresh start for thousands of students previously disqualified by vague records. During that year's orientation, some schools retold Adrienne Rowe's story as an example of quiet perseverance that impacts social structures. A sociology professor remarked, "We cannot change the past, but we can alter what the past has hurt." Students listened, partly out of curiosity, partly because for the first time, they understood that justice is not just in law books, but in revising each question on forms and every line in the system. Adrienne's story, never told by her voice, began to live through others' retellings. It lived in old letters, in the removal of a form item, and in the eyes of a new generation looking ahead, not for victory, but because they no longer had to bow and ask permission to enter. That is when justice stops being abstract and becomes a correction of what was once taken for granted. A 1-minute and 13-second video was sent to the governor's office with the title, "No Name Needed to See What's Wrong." It was self-recorded by an 11th grade student from a small western town. In the video, he reenacted the shocking kick not as a parody but with full restraint. Everything was minimalistic. An empty room, a tipped wooden chair, dim light from a window. He wore a normal school uniform, no name, and did not show the face of the kicked person. The kick was slow, hitting emptiness, the absence of identity. At the end, white text appeared on a black screen. It could be my mother or me. Within just 3 hours after the video was sent, hundreds of shares appeared on high school student forums. Some classes, instead of discussing the regular essay, chose to talk about the emotions stirred by the clip. An English teacher wrote in an email to the Department of Education, "It is not a work of art, but an ethical question." That question, coming from an anonymous boy, made many adults pause, not because they were accused, but because they realized they had stood by silently when they should have spoken up. Adrienne Rowe received the video and a handwritten letter from the boy's teacher. She did not hold a press conference or issue an official statement. After 2 days, she sent back a gray envelope containing a single handwritten line. "I never wanted to replace anyone, but if I stand at the right moment, you keep moving forward." The line was unsigned, but the recipient understood. It bore the same italic handwriting that had appeared in her previous messages. The letter was posted by the teacher on the classroom bulletin board the next morning. No one spoke aloud, yet many students stopped before the board, not to see the sender's name, but to read those 14 words over and over. During the civic education class that day, a student asked a question the teacher could not immediately answer. If justice can come from a wrong kick, then are we teaching our students how to stand up or only how to bow before procedure? The question was recorded and sent to the district's specialist committee as a suggested topic for next semester's discussion. The story did not become a social media trend, nor did it spark loud charity campaigns, but it continued to spread. From one school bulletin board to another, from one classroom corner to a school activity room. In each place, a student asked, "What if that was my mother?" And each time, the adults around were forced to face the reality that what had once been seen as isolated incidents was raising questions about how society teaches young people right and wrong. Adrienne did not appear to confirm or deny anything, but from the video of an anonymous student to her simple response, the clearest thing was not the identity of the person kicked, but what we are willing to do when the one we love is the one sitting in that chair. That is when justice no longer takes the form of scales, but becomes a small act, daring to speak, to ask, and to stand with those who have no voice. Brody walked through the prison gates as if entering an old room where he had locked himself repeatedly in a cycle of wrong choices. No cameras followed him, no news reports aired at the moment of his transfer. The metal gates made no loud echoes, but the sound of the heavy door closing behind him made a few guards pause for a second. One guard said Brody showed no reaction. No resistance, nor did he lower his head when ordered inside. No further explanation was needed because his actions changed nothing. The sentence was clear, and no one could pay his price for him. Hundreds of miles away, a closed-door meeting took place among state cabinet members. One key agenda item was the proposal to appoint Adrienne Rowe as a federal representative on a justice reform committee. Everyone in the room agreed on her capability and influence, a woman who rarely spoke but created more ripple effect than any previous campaign. However, when the official invitation was sent, her reply was a brief email. "I will not accept a role I am not yet worthy of. There are still many voices unheard." The answer was not a harsh refusal, but made clear that she never entered this story to gain titles. Adrienne's decision surprised some colleagues. Some argued she should accept the position to amplify the message from within the system. Others understood that by refusing, the message retained its full weight. They recalled the moment she walked out of the courtroom without a word, eyes fixed forward, feet steady despite the silent corridor. That same silence now reflected strongly upon those who had thought justice existed only through titles or badges. Her refusal to accept the federal nomination did not diminish her reputation. On the contrary, it led many social organizations to seek permission to use her image in community dialogues. All requests were met with a consistent response. "I will not be the centerpiece of any campaign. Let those left behind tell their own stories." Rather than appearing on camera, she chose to visit rehabilitation centers, speak with the wrongfully convicted, take notes, listen, and let them speak. These acts went unreported by the media, but entered human rights organizations' internal reports as living proof of a leadership model that needs no podium. At an interstate symposium, a professor from the East remarked, "Someone who refuses to step up because they know others remain unheard, that is the person the system needs to learn from." Though unnamed, the room understood he referred to Adrienne Rowe. She never asked for praise, but by declining rewards, her action became the clearest statement, not out of humility, but because she knew too many deserved reform seats but were never invited. Sometimes refusing the highest seat is the way to open more seats for those pushed to the margins. A televised panel ended in an awkward silence after a female reporter in the front row asked the last question. The cameras were off, yet her voice lingered enough to pause the entire crew. "Don't you see yourself as a victim?" The question was not an attack, but a sincere attempt to understand. Adrienne Rowe looked directly at her, unblinking, offering no evasion or excuse. "If I were a victim, that kick would still be happening," she said firmly, each word etched like steel onto the table before her. Her reply was not a denial of pain, but a sharp reminder that sometimes being hit matters less than who will be hit next if you don't stand up. After that day, Adrienne's response was clipped into a short segment and widely shared across social media platforms. Without background music or effects, the video lasted exactly 6 seconds, but was viewed millions of times. Comments below are no longer focused on the incident or her identity. Instead, people began asking, "So, when did we stand up, and for whom?" That evening's main news broadcast aired a report over 10 minutes long, summarizing the entire journey from the moment Adrienne was kicked in the courtroom to Brody's sentencing. Rather than ending with images of praise or victory, the report closed with a simple photo. Adrienne standing in the hearing room, hand resting on an old file, silent, eyes fixed on those debating ahead. The headline appeared at the bottom of the screen: "A woman who did not need to win, only for the system to pause for a moment and see its fault." The words were unembellished, unglorified, yet striking for their accuracy and humble acknowledgement of the outcome. Across journalism schools nationwide, that report was used as a rare example of storytelling that did not focus on the protagonist, but on the movement of the system. A veteran lecturer commented, "This is not a story about a main character. It is the recording of a break, when power, prejudice, and habit must stop long enough to look in the mirror." In a media environment often chasing charismatic icons, ending with a concept like pausing to reflect was unprecedented. Adrienne did not speak out after the report aired. She did not comment, repost, or appear at any press conferences afterward. But the next day, a status was posted on the official website of the governor's office, believed to be written by her. "I do not wish anyone to remember my name. I only hope that next time, when someone else is mistreated, there will be someone clear-headed enough not to think it is trivial." Without a signature or image, those words became the most valuable closing statement for a chapter she never sought to center. She never needed to win. She only needed the world to pause long enough to ask, "Where did we go wrong?" And that is how real change began. Within less than 3 months after the trial concluded, a wave of internal notices was sent to police departments at the county and state levels. What surprised the media was not the new regulations, but that over 30 officers voluntarily requested temporary leave with a single reason: reevaluating personal awareness. No one forced them. No rule required a law enforcement force to self-examine after an event, yet the heavy silence of Adrienne Rowe achieved what dozens of reform documents had never done. It compelled insiders to reflect. Among them was Captain Hal Conway, formerly a high-ranking leader of one of the state's fastest response teams. He was not involved in Brody's case, nor had he ever been suspended. But after the incident, he reviewed every complaint filed against his team over the past 10 years. Cases marked as handled, or insufficient evidence, or response within policy prompted him to handwrite letters to each individual involved. And every letter began the same way: "I am not writing because the court requires it, but because I no longer want to silence my conscience with excuses." Near the end, he referenced Adrienne succinctly: "Because someone once stayed seated despite being kicked, I considered standing up from my place." These letters were never officially published, but some recipients shared excerpts on social media. Some replied, others remained silent. Notably, no one mocked Conway, nor did anyone treat the apology as a weapon for retaliation. There seemed to be an unspoken understanding that Brody's kick shattered not only the victim's trust, but also the uneasy comfort many in the force used to conceal their doubt. When a woman who never spoke out still forced systemic change, stepping down from power was no longer a sign of weakness, but the start of redefining true strength. Several police academies began offering new training sessions for officers on temporary leave, calling it the ethics renewal cycle. The curriculum did not focus on technical response, but on one question. If you are not the one kicking but remain still, do you think you are innocent? There was no correct answer, no test to pass. The question aimed to shake the foundations the law enforcement community had taken for granted. That silence is neutrality, and neutrality is safety. In a closed-door discussion between academy instructors and the officers on leave, someone asked, "Has anyone ever thought of writing an apology letter before she was kicked?" The room fell silent. For the first time in years, they realized that awakening did not come from a loud rally, but from the small moment when a kicked person chose to remain seated so no one else would bear the next blow. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the once proud force is relearning, from someone who never demanded what they must do. Shortly after the voluntary resignation letters from officers were submitted, another internal document appeared on the desks of most law enforcement leaders. An updated definition of a good police officer. Instead of familiar phrases like quick reflexes, split-second decision-making, or no hesitation when facing danger, this time the job description was rewritten with a completely different focus. Someone who knows how to restrain reflexes when unnecessary. Just one line, but it changed the entire standard for evaluating an officer in the new era. The phrase was unembellished. It did not glamorize officers with courage, nor did it turn them into invincible icons. It brought the law enforcement force back to its primal core, knowing where the limits of power lie and when to stop. This update quickly spread to academies, internal oversight boards, and gradually became a topic of debate in many policy meetings across states. Though many were confused, no one could deny that continuing to call someone good for immediate action was causing the entire system to lose its stopping point. Adrienne Rowe did not comment on this change. She did not speak at symposiums nor issue any official statements on any media platform. But a brief message was sent from her office to all justice investigation units in the states, with two specific requests. First, every complaint file rejected in the past 6 months must be reviewed and reported quarterly. Second, every case deemed lacking prosecutorial elements must have a specific written reason, recorded, accompanied by the signature of the final handler. The final line of the official letter was a solitary commitment, without a heading, straightforward. No next kick shall occur in the dark. Those who read the document felt the quiet power in it, not because of threatening language, but because of absolute frankness. That sentence spoke not only of Brody's kick, but also targeted all ignored acts, all violations once justified by vague clauses in internal handling procedures. It was a reminder of the light, not in the courtroom, but right on the desk where files were once approved. Not long after, several police departments began publicly posting rejection rates and accompanying reasons. Some independent investigative units were reestablished or granted expanded authority to oversee internal administrative decisions. These moves were not hailed as victories, nor branded as major reforms, but they began creating slow shifts, what Adrienne once called sustainable change, though quiet. Amid these movements, no one mentioned her name much anymore, but in the halls of justice, places once bright with scandal and then darkened by neglect, a new presence began to appear, the gaze of those daring to confront old files with a renewed spirit. And when that happened, the definition of a good police officer no longer rested on spokespersons' lips, but in every action daring enough to stop and choose what is right. At a public high school in Fairmont County, an experimental civic education program drew attention not only for its modern approach, but also for its choice of real-life examples to teach students about human dignity. In the newly released textbook, alongside traditional lessons on rights and responsibilities, Chapter 13 stood out. Dignity does not depend on rank. This chapter avoided technical jargon or dry theory, instead recounting Adrienne Rowe's story through actions and consequences. focusing on the moment a woman was kicked in court and how she chose to face it without directly naming her or mentioning her title. The teacher explained the goal was not to create idols, but to help students realize dignity lies not in prominence, but in how a person acts when stripped of social status. Including such a controversial case in the curriculum sparked debate among the parent board. Some worried the material was too heavy for young students. Yet after the first lesson, letters began pouring into the school office from students, forcing even the skeptics to reconsider. One sixth grader's reflection was selected to be read at the year-end assembly. The short, simple note, written in hesitant handwriting, said, "I don't know her name, but if someone kicked my mom, I hope she would stand up like that, and if she can't, I will hold her hand tight so she doesn't fall." The auditorium fell silent after the reading. No applause, no comments, just many tear-filled eyes. The principal told reporters that what moved him most was not the story of a governor, but how students grasped the lesson, not through titles, but through imagery, the image of a woman calmly stepping out of pain without shouting for her dignity back. Pedagogically, he believed this was the most effective teaching, letting children fill the gaps themselves, encouraging questions rather than supplying answers. After the program spread, many schools in other states requested permission to integrate the chapter into their ethics and civic education classes. The content was praised for not promoting opposition or blame, but sparking reflection on personal responsibility and the limits of power in society. Some teachers noted students began questioning unfair situations more, from line cutting to being called the wrong name. Without mentioning titles or verdicts, the book opened a new chapter, where human worth was not measured by seat or badge. When a 12-year-old stands with the mistreated, not because they are famous, but because it is right, society gains a stronger chance to grow than any reform ever printed on paper. A handwritten letter from a small public school in Southern Virginia, typed on plain white paper with simple handwriting and no title, arrived at the governor's office. A sociology teacher shared their feelings after witnessing 8th graders discuss dignity and right action based on the federal court case where Adrian Rowe was attacked. The teacher wrote, "I have taught hundreds of children, but rarely seen them so silent while reviewing that moment, not out of fear, but because they understood some things don't need shouting to become landmarks." He ended simply yet sincerely, "Thank you for helping my students realize you don't have to be a hero to change society." The governor's office received hundreds of letters monthly, but Adrian Rowe personally read and replied to this one. The printed response contained only one handwritten line added beneath, "Not to change," just to help society pause long enough to see what it has done. That phrase was copied and posted on a bulletin board in the office hallway, a place frequently visited by guests. No one discussed it aloud, but everyone passing by looked carefully, as if trying to catch the rare, slow rhythm amid a hectic life. Those words quickly spread through academia as a new cognitive model for the role of public service. Many universities, rather than teaching leadership through illustrious achievements, began incorporating that response into the introductions of public policy seminars. A professor from Georgetown University called it the silent definition of social influence, where a person does not need to offer grand solutions but simply stand still at the right moment, long enough to make others reflect on themselves. In internal meetings, the legislative team that had worked alongside Adrian Rowe realized that those seemingly brief lines were becoming a guiding principle for new conduct during crises. A senior aide shared that since the response letter was posted, many leaders, when writing reports, would ask themselves, "Am I acting too quickly to avoid responsibility?" Not to delay reform, but to ensure each decision is made in the right context, at a pace human conscience can follow. As for Adrienne, she did not hold press conferences, publicly comment on the letter, or issue any official statements about public reactions. But since that day, her internal speeches at closed-door meetings with agencies began adopting a new structure, opening with an ethical question and closing with a commitment to monitor long-term consequences. She did not advise anyone to act as she did, nor did she recount her experience. Instead, she emphasized each system's role in recognizing errors before they require victims to stop them. An education advisor with years of experience at Capitol Hill commented, "Adrienne Rowe's response is not leadership in the traditional sense, but it forced all of us to pause, and that pause is the real starting point for reviewing the entire process." Perhaps in a world where media prioritizes speed and results, a slow-spoken phrase, not meant to score points or grab attention, carries enough weight to shift an entire mindset. And if one person can write 6 words that make a whole system look in the mirror, then maybe what society truly needs is not a new leader, but a reflection still enough to realize where it once went astray. The photo of Adrienne standing in the courtroom, abdomen still pressed from the kick, eyes locked on the officer who struck her, was added to the state university's curriculum in a course titled History of Silent Acts of Resistance. The image lacked names or dates, only bearing the caption, "When steadfastness forces a system to halt." The decision to keep her anonymous was to focus students on the act itself, not her status. During a master's thesis defense, student Dana Ellison used Adrienne's image to explain silent protest, saying, "Her posture isn't endurance but a refusal to bow without words or anger, shaking faith in the justice system." When asked if it was passive acceptance, Dana responded, if she accepted, the system wouldn't have stopped. Teaching materials were updated to distinguish resignation from passive resistance, noting that some resistance lies in refusing to respond as expected, forcing institutions to rethink power and ethical boundaries. At a law seminar on silent symbols' impact on reform, Adrienne wasn't present, but her story was central. A note inside a student compilation read, "When one needs no introduction, their actions speak." Afterward, a senior student wrote that he nearly quit law school, but the photo inspired him to continue, realizing one can stand firm quietly and still make a difference. Adrienne's silent presence became a powerful truth, not because of her title, but because she refused to be anything less than herself. She stood firm in a courtroom that had ignored many others' dignity, forcing the system to rethink its view. At a ceremony in the State Justice Academy, former Judge Milton Reeves shared how the photo changed his view. Justice isn't just reason. The scariest part wasn't the kick, but her gaze afterward. That look made every judicial robe feel weightless. A powerless person with no shout made the system stop. His words were met with silence, a clear recognition of a system forced to reckon with itself. After the speeches, a special row of seats was arranged in the front row, right before the stage. No one sat there. Only a small, handwritten sign rested on the middle seat, written in italic script. "This seat is reserved for anyone who has ever been pushed out of the place called justice." No name was listed, no one assigned, yet the attendees silently looked toward it, not because the empty seat was for Adrienne, but because her absence had become a statement. This story does not belong to one individual, but to those who have never been seen. A young law student invited to speak at the end of the program said she had printed Adrienne's photo as a small poster and placed it inside her locker, not out of admiration, but to remind herself each time she entered a courtroom in the future that standing tall is not about proving oneself right, but about protecting others when they have no one by their side. She ended her speech with a line that silenced the room once again. "I have never met that woman, but her very absence forced us to show up." The media covered the ceremony as an event marking a symbolic change. No one walked on stage to receive medals. No formal moments of praise were held. All that remained were the handwritten message, the gaze of a retired judge, and an empty chair with no owner. Some left early but turned back for a final look at that seat. Some stood silently for a long moment, as if to make sure the chair would still be there next time, reserved for anyone ever excluded from the justice dialogue, simply because they did not fit the system's expectation. After the ceremony, a brief news segment aired on local television. The anchor did not mention Adrienne's name, nor replay the clip that once shocked viewers. Instead, they filmed the empty chair in the auditorium and Milton Reeves' voice echoed one last time, "Justice is not measured by verdicts, but by whether the system dares to stop when it becomes the offender." When night fell, the stage was cleared, the lights completely turned off, yet the small sign remained on the middle seat. A technician prepared to pack up, but the manager motioned to leave it. "We need to let others see it," he said, "because maybe next time the one who needs it will come." The announcement was sent out on Monday morning, right as everyone was preparing for the work week ahead. Without prior warning or an internal meeting, a brief statement came from Adrienne Rowe's former office. "I don't do politics. I create silence." There was no explanation, no mention of reasons for leaving, nor any hint of plans. Yet this minimalist message sent ripples through the entire system. Accustomed to long statements and strategic farewells, the first to read the announcement was her legal assistant, a young lawyer with less than 2 years in the field. Confused, he took the printed notice to the office and asked if it was a draft sent by mistake. Adrienne confirmed it was final without showing any emotion, signing off the last documents before him. Upon hearing the news, the remaining staff quickly convened behind closed doors. Some argued she should stay until the end of the quarter to maintain stability in federal reports, while others claimed she was the only one preserving the system's integrity. Still, none of these arguments swayed the carefully made decision. Later that day, an internal representative sent an email on behalf of the entire office, requesting to discuss the decision, citing her influence, responsibility, and the public's need for her to remain. Her response wasn't a formal letter, but a direct statement in a small meeting that afternoon. "You don't need to keep me. Just keep what's right in every process." The tone wasn't farewell. It felt more like passing the torch, not through power but through principle. The next morning, the office lit up as usual. Meetings proceeded, documents were signed and filed on schedule. Yet no one asked who would replace her. Everyone understood the role left behind couldn't be filled by one person, but by a collective willing to uphold the values she quietly established. Inside her filing cabinet, an old case file was found, marked with documents from the smallest incidents, cases many had once considered insignificant, to keep. At the file's end was a note: "No pain is too small to be forgotten." On her desk, aside from a routine coffee cup and a few notebooks, nothing notable remained. No memorabilia, no plaques, no photos. Yet when the support staff checked her desk, they found one small detail. The cabinet lock was left open. Inside, only a pen and a blank sheet of paper placed neatly in a frame, seemingly left for the next person to write what still needed doing. That weekend, a local news outlet revisited the story of Adrienne's assault in the courtroom. This time, they did not mention the lawsuit, replay the footage, or discuss the former officer's charges or sentence. Instead, they aired a single old photo, Adrienne standing motionless in a narrow frame, eyes steady amid chaos. The host closed with a line repeated from her statement that week: "She doesn't do politics, she creates silence." That silence now leaves many wondering what remains once the noise fades. On Friday morning, Adrienne Rowe left her post quietly and decisively, just as she had entered the courtroom, leaving a silent impact that made the system pause and adjust. She arrived and left on time, with no fanfare or sirens, unnoticed by passers-by. Staff worked as usual, some greeting her briefly, others watching from afar. Adrienne signed final documents and spoke briefly with colleagues, her focused gaze scanning the building as if memorizing what still needed protection. Her departure became clear when a new handwritten note appeared on the main bulletin board. "From tomorrow, every gaze must be scrutinized before raising a foot." A simple line spoke volumes, reminding everyone that professional reflexes should never outweigh humanity. By noon, many stopped to read the note. Leaders held emergency meetings to review pending cases for bias or neglect. A senior officer noted that Adrienne left at the right time, when her presence forced everyone to question their direction. This pause was recorded as a new awareness. Silence is sometimes the only way for important truths to be heard. That afternoon, a local news outlet reported her departure without fanfare, showing only the bulletin board note. That evening, a university lecturer shared the line with students, asking if pausing to reflect should be mandatory in all fields of authority. No immediate answers came, but the question was noted. An important silence, just like Adrienne's. In the district courthouse, at the far corner of courtroom 3, a wooden chair sits permanently, unmoved and unused in any trial. It has no nameplate or decoration and isn't on the official seating chart, yet everyone knows it's not there by chance. This is the chair Adrienne Rowe once occupied on the day a steady order was shaken by a kick and silence. Since then, no one has suggested moving it, and it's been cleaned and kept exactly as she left it. First-time visitors pause before the chair, curious why it draws so much attention. Elderly passers-by purse their lips, and court staff who witnessed that day keep a respectful distance. Once, a group of schoolchildren toured the courtroom. One girl tugged her mother and asked, "Whose chair is that?" The mother whispered, "It belongs to someone who made the whole courtroom fall silent." That silence wasn't from fear, but from crossing the line of justice unknowingly. Without accusations or anger, it forced the system to reflect more than any petition could. The chair became an unwritten collective memory, always present as a reminder. A young judge said he always looks to that chair first, not in tribute, but to ask if he's truly hearing every voice or blinded by unseen bias. Since Adrienne's stand, many judicial officials began pausing to question their reflexes before trials, not doubting colleagues, but their own. Every morning, before trials start, a court attendant gently cleans and aligns the chair. This act isn't about cleanliness, but remembrance. Veteran staff understand it as a silent tribute to justice. A nameless chair that keeps the system mindful. The staff member once asked an older colleague why no one stored the chair away, or at least marked it to avoid confusion with others. The colleague just smiled, pointed at the chair and said, "Because everyone remembers it without a note." Since Adrienne Rowe held her stance after the kick and made the entire room pause, that chair was no longer an object without meaning. It became proof of a moment when justice was tested and a starting point for deep reflection within everyone present that day. Dusting the chair each morning was not in his job description, but he did it out of a new reflex, not because anyone asked, but because he believed that beginning the workday with an act reminding him of standards would at least help him approach each task with sharper eyes. He had never met Adrienne, only heard stories and seen photos preserved in internal documents, but something in her gaze made him unable to ignore it. It was not anger nor pride, but a calmness strong enough to quiet all noise around it. 3 years after the kick shook the courtroom, no similar incidents occurred at the district court. No one was pushed out of seats, no one shouted at during hearings, no gaze was overlooked as if invisible, no list of prevented incidents was published, nor were moments of restrained reflexes named. But in periodic reports, notes stating no violations of conduct rules appeared repeatedly under courtroom number 3. Those once quick to lose patience when challenged now choose to invite lawyers outside rather than raise their voices unnecessarily. Adrienne never returned to that courtroom. She did not need to, but many believed her presence never left. It remained in every lighter lift of a chair, every judge who paused a few extra seconds to hear the last words of an unfamiliar face. That impact was not measurable by statistics, but could be felt in the courtroom's atmosphere, calm, solemn, and knowing when to interrupt at the right moment. One day, when a group of law students toured the court, the guide pointed to the chair in the corner and said, "This is not a relic, nor a symbol of honor. It is a reminder that silence, when held at the right time, can make every voice afterward clearer." The students took notes. Some stared at the chair long enough to imagine the woman who once sat there, but no one needed to know the whole story. Just knowing that from that day the system paused for a beat and then moved forward with lighter steps was enough. On the eastern grounds of the Federal Academy, Between the training halls and the administrative building, a stone wall stands tall. There is no plaque, no inscription on its smooth surface. Newcomers often pass without understanding its meaning, but those who have studied there know well. The wall isn't meant to honor anyone, but to remind us of something deeper. The wall stands firm along the path that all must take between classrooms. There is no fence or sign telling people to stop, yet they do. Each trainee instinctively slows down. Some pause quietly, others glance briefly, but all show a rare focus unseen anywhere else on campus. Veteran instructors say it can't be taught in lessons. It's the awareness that justice is not about rank or uniform, but about how one responds when facing someone more vulnerable. One early autumn morning, while mist still lingered, a young trainee approached the wall. Without looking around or rushing past, he stood straight and touched the cool stone. No one prompted him, no cameras recorded, yet his whispered words were clear enough to still the footsteps behind him. I will never kick someone just because they don't wear a badge. It was not a vow, nor a written promise, but the instructor, following silently, took note. That statement marked the first step toward a new reflex, the reflex to restrain action and see the person before the position. Since the district court incident, the Academy has undergone many changes. Lessons now include ambiguous power dynamics, where the line between suspect and overlooked person is thin. Trainees no longer learn that reflex means acting fast, but when to pause and evaluate the full picture. Though unofficial, the stone wall became part of the implicit moral education, teaching not through words, but through presence. Admissions officers report a subtle shift in how trainees respond to scenarios. They no longer rush to assert control, but ask instead, who is this person? Not to investigate identity, but to remind themselves that before them stands a human, not a case file on wheels. Some suggested adding a plaque or explanation for newcomers, but the academy director refused. If someone needs a sign to know why to stop, maybe they aren't ready to wear the uniform entrusted to them, and so the wall stands quietly, unchanged. But visited by more and more who pause, Adrienne Rowe never set foot in that academy, never spoke in lecture halls or took an oath there. Yet her legacy extended far beyond that courtroom day. It left a mark on policy changes, on new ethics courses, and the silent witness of a nameless stone wall. For there, people began to understand justice does not start with power, but with knowing when to stop, to ask if you are facing what's right or stepping over someone else. One afternoon in mid-month, as soft sunlight bathed the academy courtyard, a small stone was quietly placed at the base of the wall. No one knows who left it, no camera captured the moment. The stone was small, palm size, polished smooth with a single carved line. She didn't need to win, but made the whole system pause. No ornament, no signature, just a quiet message resting in the shade at the wall's base. The act quickly spread throughout the academy community. Young students, already familiar with the silent presence of the stone, began pausing longer whenever they passed by. The small stone made people bend down to read, then look up and reflect. In an environment that emphasized decisiveness, speed, and quick reactions, the appearance of an object that made people slow down became a new symbol. It did not change the curriculum or add lectures, but created a pause long enough for young people to start questioning the purpose of the power they were learning to wield. At the administrative office, a group of instructors decided not to remove the stone. After an internal meeting, they concluded that if a small gesture like that could make students pause and think an extra second before acting, it served the spirit of reform well. One even suggested keeping the stone in place as an implicit part of the school's values. No announcements, no fanfare, just an unwritten rule respected as the first law. Respect the person before acting on the title. Gradually, student tour groups were guided through that area as a stop for ethical orientation. No narration, just one simple request. Remain silent for 30 seconds before the stone. Some closed their eyes, some bowed their heads, and others stood still. But most left with a changed mindset, not one of anger, but a sense of responsibility. From that small stone, another lesson spread among law enforcement. Not every kick causes someone to fall. The kick that day, aimed at Adrienne Rowe, did not bring her down. Instead, it forced an entire society, from citizens to officials, from students to officers, to take a step back. Not a step back in fear, but a necessary pause to look inward. Because if they kept moving forward with the old momentum, they might trample those who deserved to be heard. Years later, when an academic article analyzed the reform period after the Brody case, it cited the image of that small stone as a milestone. The author did not glorify Adrienne or turn her into a legend. Instead, they spoke of a phenomenon, a person refusing to react as expected, yet creating a ripple effect far beyond any outburst of anger. Adrienne's strength lay not in calls to action, but in a quiet, firm choice to hold her ground so that what was wrong could reveal itself. And that was what remained in the end. A small stone, a seemingly insignificant kick, and a woman who did not fight back, but caused the entire system to pause long enough to realize it had veered off course. In a society too used to instinctive reactions, sometimes the deepest resistance is the moment we do not retaliate, forcing everything around us to reflect. That kick did not make anyone fall, but it did something far more important. It made a nation pause, just long enough to avoid repeating the same mistake. The act quickly spread throughout the academy community. Students, accustomed to the silent presence of the stone, began pausing longer whenever they passed by. In a culture that prized speed, decisiveness, and quick reactions, the stone emerged as a powerful symbol, a quiet reminder for young people to question the true purpose of the power they were learning to wield. Instructors decided not to remove the stone, recognizing that such a small gesture encouraged a thoughtful pause before action. It became an unwritten rule within the school's values: respect the person before the title. Student tours included a silent 30-second stop at the stone, where many closed their eyes or bowed their heads, leaving with a renewed sense of responsibility rather than anger. The kick aimed at Adrienne did not bring her down. Instead, it forced an entire society, from citizens to officials, students to officers, to take a necessary step back, not a retreat born of fear, but a pause to reflect on their actions. Years later, academics cited the stone as a landmark moment, symbolizing how one person's silent stand can spark a ripple effect far beyond any outburst of anger. Adrienne's strength lay in her quiet refusal to retaliate, allowing injustice to reveal itself naturally. That small kick made the entire system pause and recognize where it had gone off course. Sometimes, the deepest resistance is not in fighting back, but in having the courage to stop and look inward, so that the same mistakes are not repeated.